I would like to welcome to the show Matt Mitchell, Senior Fellow in the Center for Human Freedom at the Fraser Institute and co-author of the new report, Economic Freedom of the World 2025. Welcome to Free the Economy, Matt.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, to get us started, let's give listeners, viewers, a quick history of actually your career and how you ended up at the Fraser Institute doing the work you do now.
Oh, great. Yeah, so I have been a consumer of the economic freedom of the world research really for the past 2 decades, both as a teacher and then as a researcher. I have found that there's sort of in my view, there's no better way to illustrate the benefits of economic freedom than to just roll up your sleeves and measure it and then see, how do outcomes compare in places that are more economically free to those that are less economically free. So my career, I started, right out of graduate school at George Mason. I was at the Mercatus Center for a dozen years, worked on a number of different issues, state policy and federal policy. I focused a lot on favoritism. And then in the last 3 years, I've been working actually at the Fraser Institute, helping to commission the Economic Freedom of the World reports and then writing sort of complementary pieces around those. One of the things that was a lot of fun once I got to Fraser is I also did a project working actually with my former colleague Pete Becky at George Mason on the realities of socialism. So there was an example of like sort of digging into the history in places that have lack economic freedom in the extreme. So that's kind of I guess, a brief encapsulation.
And the Fraser Institute is mostly constituted by our friends to the north, the Canadians.
That's right. Yes. So we Fraser just celebrated its 50th anniversary. It was founded, depending on who you ask, either in 1974 or 1975 in Vancouver, Canada, by Mike Walker. And it's sort of like the kind of similar to the CEI of Canada, I would say.
Well, that is an excellent title. So tell us about the Economic Freedom of the World report. Like you said, this body of research has been around a long time, very, very highly cited. Lots of people go to it as a place for a sort of referee on where we see freer economies around the world with a lot of kind of rigorous data behind it. How do you measure freedom?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first, I think it might be helpful to talk about, what exactly is economic freedom, because there's a lot of you ask different people and you might get different answers. Um, and so the idea of this index came out of, I mentioned Mike Walker is the founder of the Fraser Institute. He's also the sort of this index was sort of his brainchild. So there was a Mont Pelerin Society meeting in London back in 1984, and they were debating, it being the year 1984, they were debating Orwell and whether economic freedom correlates with political freedom and other types of civil liberties, and versus whether they're, are they complements or they substitutes. And the historian Paul Johnson was there, no, several Nobel laureates were there. And ultimately, they kind of threw up their hands and said, well, it's an interesting set of questions, but we have no way of measuring it. So afterwards, Mike Walker then sat down with Milton and Rose Friedman, and they decided to, he said, why don't we measure it? From what I understand, I think Milton, I think, was a little skeptical at first, but it was Rose who really became, an early advocate and said, "Yeah, absolutely, we can do this." And so, what they ended up doing is they held a series of conferences over the course of a decade, and they had eminent historians and economists. They had three Nobel laureates participate, and they ultimately came together, one with an idea of what exactly is economic freedom, and then ultimately an index. So that was a long introduction. Let me first say what, sort of what is economic freedom. Simply put, people have more economic freedom if they're allowed to make more of their own economic choices. So I use all these words are sort of carefully chosen. The allowed part is really important because economic freedom isn't about what I am able to do or capable of doing. I can't buy a yacht. I would like to, but I can't. But I am allowed to. And then I also use the word more because in the real world, we can sort of think philosophically in terms of maximal economic freedom, but in the real world, economic freedom can be constrained on more or less constrained and on different dimensions. So it really has to do with, does the government allow you, do other people allow you to exchange with one another, to acquire and use productive property, to go into business and start a new market? Those sorts of things. And so the way they measure it, today the modern index, it's the lead author is Bob Lawson. He worked with Jim Gortney on the original index, and has been the lead author for 30 years now. The way they do it is they look at 45 different indicators of government policy, and really each one is going back to that initial question: is does the government allow you to make economic choices? And so they look at things like tax rates and regulations, barriers to entry. They look at the government's promise to protect property. Are you allowed to acquire and use property, to enter into contracts with others? They look at the government's promise to maintain the value of currency. So are you allowed to access currency that doesn't lose its value over time? And of course, they look at international trade. Are you allowed to buy and sell with people from other countries? So they put all this together, they come up with an index, and it rates each of 165 countries around the world on this scale of 0 to 10, 10 being the most free and 0 being the least free. And so now we have this kind of tangible measure of the degree to which people are allowed to make their own choices. And it goes back several decades now, all the way to 1970.
Excellent. So now I saw a couple weeks ago this really caught my eye. I mentioned it in a previous episode, actually, in our the news summary that goes out in front of the interview. Fraser sent out what they called sort of a pre-release for the upcoming report, specifically about tariff rates. Obviously, tariff rates are very much in the news here in Washington, D.C., in the United
Yeah.
States in general, with the Trump administration's tariff raises in the last few months. Um, and that release emphasized how much tariff rates had increased. Um, and that headline was average U.S. tariffs increased from 1.5% to 28%, now comparable to rates in Iran and Sudan.
Yeah.
Later on in that same release, they also compared it to very high rates in Djibouti, a small country in East Africa. If listeners are not familiar, um, so there's a lot going on there. One, we knew tariffs were high, true, but I think this ranking is interesting, and the international comparisons are interesting, because one of the things that defenders of the current high tariffs have said is, oh, well, look around the world, lots of other countries have high tariff rates or much higher tariff rates than the ones the U.S. had. Um, but a lot of those countries that have those high tariff rates are like Iran and Sudan and Djibouti. Why is it that so many of the other high tariff rate countries in the world seem to be poor, non-industrialized, non-advanced nations?
Right.
And if that is the case, is there some hint there for whether extremely high tariff rates make sense for a country, an economy like the US?
Yeah. Yeah. So let's maybe just start with some statistics. So let's take the 15 countries in the world with the highest tariff rates, and these are average tariff rates. So they include exemptions. They're including the fact that they might impose zero tariff rates on some countries with whom they have free trade agreements. So the 15 countries in the world with the highest tariff rates, and compare them with the 15 countries in the world with the lowest tariff rates. So the GDP per capita in the 15 countries in the world with the highest tariff rates is $9,703 a year. If you compare it with the 15 countries in the world with the lowest tariff rates, it's 43,502. So it's 4.5 times greater in those low tariff countries than it is in the high tariff countries. Now, correlation is not causation. Maybe it happens to go in the opposite direction. Maybe rich countries just choose to have lower tariffs, and there probably is some evidence that causality does actually go in both directions. But at the very least, to me, I look at that and say, gee, do we really want to join the ranks of Djibouti and Sudan and Iran, or would we rather be compared to Canada and Estonia and the United Kingdom and Australia? To me, I'd much rather be in the latter category. So One reason, I think there is probably a direct reason for why high tariffs are associated with lower income, which is, I think there is some causality here, which is, tariffs restrict economic freedom. They restrict your ability to buy and sell from other countries. Ultimately, this means that you're less able to specialize based on comparative advantage. We know from Adam Smith that countries prosper when they are able to specialize based on comparative advantage. And so I think there is probably a direct causal relationship there. There's other ways to think about it too, though, which are less direct. I think it's also plausible that a very low income country that has very poor governance probably has a hard time collecting other types of taxes like income taxes and sales taxes. And so they tend to rely on relatively easier to collect taxes like tariffs because it's easier. You may only have a few ports, you may of entry, you may only have a few places where goods are coming in, and so it's just a simpler way to tax. And that's part of the reason why the United States, back when it was a low income country, that's why we used to rely on high tariffs as well. But over time, as countries develop, they tend to diversify and not rely on on just one source of taxes, and that's for better or worse. But they also tend to move in. They tend to lower their tariff rates. And in the U.S., we've played an incredibly important role in the post-World War era of being a leader in ushering in multilateral free trade agreements and essentially creating this world of globalization, which has just yesterday and the day before and the day before that lifted 110,000 people out of poverty every single day for the last 50 years. So it's a pretty remarkable role that the U.S. has once played, and now we're sort of abandoning that.
Well, another one of these defenses or sort of responses we hear from the current tariff surge is that they are these much higher than normal tariffs are merely sort of a short-term negotiating tactic to get other countries to change their policy in other areas, or maybe not in other tariff areas, but to change their policy on things other than tariff rates. Because, of course, in the world of trade negotiations, there are what's called non-tariff barriers to trade, right?
Mhm.
There are other policies that maybe keep U.S. exports out of foreign markets, but they're not a percentage tariff. And so this version of what the Trump administration is supposedly doing says, well, we're going to slap a super high tariff on you until, say, Canada changes the way they do their lumber policy or their dairy policy or something like that. And then once that their policy is more fair from our perspective, then we can go back to the lower tariffs that we had before, the sort of
Right.
low tariff regime in general. Um, uh, One, what are the sort of non-tariff barriers that are out there that do really exist that say Americans would be most concerned about or that seem kind of asymmetrical, that could be arguably considered unfair? And then is there any evidence that this is actually the administration's goal?
Yeah. Well, it's hard to know what the administration's. I'll end with the last question. It's hard to know what the administration's goal is because they've named lots of different goals over time, and many of these are honestly mutually exclusive. You can't have the goal of eventually lowering tariffs, but also have the goal of shifting all your revenue to come from tariffs. You can't have the goal of keeping foreign competition out and protecting American industry while also having the goal of raising a bunch of revenue from foreign goods coming in. So we can kind of set that aside. So yes, there are lots of non-tariff barriers to trade. There are regulations that make it more difficult to buy and sell in other countries. And interestingly enough, of course, we measure that in the Economic Freedom of the World Index. And interestingly enough, the U.S. is actually one of the bigger offenders in this area. So, following the Great Recession in 2008, and then during the Obama administration, the U.S. increasingly tightened its controls on movement of people and capital within the United States. So making it more difficult for foreigners to invest in the U.S. and making it more difficult for business people to obtain visas and do business with Americans. And those changes actually reduced US measured economic freedom all the way down to 56th out of 165 countries in the world. And so, right off the bat, if we include an analysis, if we include those types of non-tariff barriers, we actually find most of the countries that Donald Trump is criticizing, really every country except for China, that he has criticized is better than we are. They have not only lower tariffs but lower non-tariff barriers to trade. So this includes all of the EU. This includes Canada. Mexico is basically tied with the United States. I think it's a little bit worse than the United States, but every other country is ranked higher than 56th compared that is on every other country that Donald Trump has targeted. It rates higher than 56th, in the US is much worse. So, to begin with, the kind of premise is wrong. Then the next question is, okay, do these tariffs, these threats of tariffs, are these an effective way to get other countries to lower their both tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade? And to me, the odd thing about this is that we have these great mechanisms that have been developed by the United States and have worked for 7 decades to lower both tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade. They're called international free trade agreements, right? They're not perfect, but they by agreeing to lower our tariffs in exchange for other countries lowering their tariffs, it's a really effective tool, especially when you're the world's largest economy. Other countries are quite responsive to that. So I don't understand the premise, and I don't think many other economists who look at this understand the premise that we need to throw that whole quite effective system that has, created lowered barriers to trade all over the world and lifted so many people out of poverty. I'm not sure why we need to throw that out. Then finally, let's take a closer look at some of the so-called agreements that the president has now signed. I put it in air quotes because they're not typical free trade agreements that actually, have details. And the problem there is that it's essentially what everybody has figured out is that Donald Trump wants the press release, but he doesn't want the actual work of negotiating, detailed trade agreements. And so, but even the press release data is not great because what's ending up happening is we're ending up with tariff rates that are 7, 8 times higher than they were before this whole mess began. So we're no better. And then even worse than that, the president is imposing really strict requirements on how the terms of trade work. So let's go back to that initial idea of economic freedom is about allowing you, Richard, to make your own economic choices. Who you want to buy from and sell to. It's not about the president of the United States dictating to whom you are allowed to sell, from whom you are allowed to buy. But the president was recently asked in a press release about, or sorry, in a press conference about these kind of vague deals, and he was extraordinarily revealing in his answer. He said He said there are no details. The details are I get to decide. I get to control how much the EU is investing into the United States, when and where I have total control. So this is not economic freedom. That if that's what happens with the trade deal, is that the one person, the president of the United States, becomes the czar of commerce and gets to decide which European countries can invest in the United States, when and where. I mean, that is totally undermining the whole purpose of free trade.
Well, I also feel like, especially with that, the purchase agreement from the U.S. EU deal, like they were leaning hard on the EU buying liquefied natural gas from the United States, for example.
Yep.
Um, that's not only is that, I think, not an ideal way economic affairs should be negotiated, but that's also not how things work in the real world at all, right? It's
Yeah.
it's not the government of France that would be buying liquefied natural gas anyway, right? You know, this often happens. I feel like we have an agency problem here, which is,
Yeah.
I said before, it's not government agencies. Usually I complain about government agencies and the regulations. We have like a moral agency problem, which is like
Yeah.
who is doing the thing that we're talking about. That's pretty basic definition. And sometimes in order to make these conversations simpler, we have sort of abstractions, like when we say, well, the US is doing this or the EU is doing that, when we actually mean all the economic actors of a certain area together, you know, if you put
Yep.
all of their decisions together, that's how much they have invested or that's how much their economy has grown or something like that. But these things aren't directed by governments, right? It would be theoretically possible to have such an agreement with, say, the People's Republic of China, because the Chinese government has a great amount of control over even
Mhm.
the sort of nominally private companies that exist there, just like it would have been possible to have that sort of big picture trade agreement with like the USSR, right? If we
Yep.
say the USSR will buy $1 billion worth of chicken legs from the United States, then at least on the USSR side, you could say, well, yes, because that's the one. There's a commissar who is making that decision. There was one person. The government is doing that. But if you say like the EU will buy billions of dollars of goods from the US, well, like the European Union government is not going to buy billions of dollars of stuff and put them in a warehouse, right?
Right.
The idea is presumably we want millions of consumers or thousands of companies in the EU to sort of do business with the US in general. So I feel like some of the reporting on it is kind of understandable that it gets sort of like, short form summarized in headlines because it's
Hmm.
complicated to explain. But I feel like sometimes those short form summaries mislead the people who are reading these stories into thinking, well, who's actually doing the stuff that we're talking about,
That's
right?
right.
Like,
No, I think you 100% have nailed it there, and a lot of this honestly goes back to what I think is a truly intellectual error that Donald Trump makes, and there's a lot of things that it's a question of whether what does Donald Trump actually believe. This is an instance where he's been quite consistent over half a century of being a public figure. He seems to fundamentally misunderstand the way trade and commerce works. You're absolutely right. Economists have this phrase where they talk about when they're analyzing economic decisions, they talk about individuals as being, the actual choosers. Only individuals make choices. Groups of people do not make choices. So even, if you get down to if you say that the American people elected, Donald Trump, well, that's not true. American people, some of them made that choice, but it was everybody made their own choice, right? And certainly when it comes down to economic decisions, it's just not true to say that the American people bought something or sold something. It's individuals who make those choices. And so part of this is quite revealing from a few months ago. Trump was asked, to describe, his approach to trade, and he said, think of America as a company, and I'm the CEO, and if you want to come here and buy stuff, you have to pay me. And that is, fundamentally an error. That doesn't describe the U.S. And to your point, it does. It sort of describes the way communist societies worked, but it doesn't even describe those very well. Like Stalin had his wishes, but he wasn't even able to. Even the most powerful dictator of the 20th century wasn't truly able to control every economic decision, which is part of the reason why those systems failed. Is that all the way down, managers have ways of exploiting the system, right? And shirking and selling, withholding products and selling them on the black market. There's a very strong incentive to do that. So not even in the extreme example does that actually work that way. And the closer you get to that type of a system, the worse things get. We don't want that type of a system. We want to be able to have 330 million Americans each making their own choices, weighing their own costs and benefits because they have the best information and the best incentives to make those decisions. A single economic czar just doesn't have a good incentive to do that.
yeah, and I wonder how how much change we've seen from, or what we can sort of like learn from the change we've seen from like Trump 1.0 to Trump 2.0.
Mhm.
There were certainly tariffs in the first Trump administration, tariffs against China, and then tariffs specifically on steel and aluminum, for example, but not the sort of giant rollout. that we've seen in the past few months of the new administration. And so we've seen with the, again, so-called Liberation Day tariffs, and then the sort of some of them have been paused, and some of them the rates have gone up and gone down, but uh, on virtually every other country, including infamously some uninhabited islands, everyone gets their own tariff rates, including penguins. Uh,
Mhm.
it's maybe not surprising that the Trump team has sort of thrown out some of the one-off country-specific free trade agreements that had previously been negotiated. So under the George W. Bush administration, we had a Central America, a free trade agreement with Central American countries and Dominican Republic, we called CAFTA-DR back in the old days, and then a lengthy, detailed free trade agreement with South Korea.
Mhm.
That's from the same era. And, the Trump team has said, no, 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 there's new reciprocal tariffs on, on these other countries, including those, say the DR and South Korea.
Well, and some of
Um,
which that Trump had negotiated with in his first term. The
well, no,
USMCA
see,
supposedly.
that's what I'm leading up to. It's
Okay, yeah,
it's it's not surprising that Trump would say, "Well, we're going to throw out those old agreements because I didn't have anything to do with those, and I'm the new genius of world trade."
right,
But when the administration the first time around decided they were going to replace NAFTA, the North
yeah,
American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico from like the Bill Clinton era, with the USMCA, and then Trump was, taking credit for like I fixed NAFTA, I renegotiated it, this is
yeah,
my accomplishment. Then they but then they threw out even that, okay, because they have new
that's
completely
right.
different tariffs on Canada and Mexico. So what what are we supposed to learn from that, Matt, if anything?
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, and also the way he renegotiated NAFTA is an illustration of our previous point here. So, NAFTA had been a more traditional multilateral free trade agreement where we agree to lower our tariffs and our non-tariff barriers to trade in exchange for other countries doing the same. That liberates Americans, Canadians, and Mexican individuals to make their own economic exchange based on their own information and incentives, right? What When he renegotiated NAFTA and called it the USMCA, for the first part, is in the main, he basically didn't do much at all. He just changed the name. But the things that he did change actually pushed us closer to the world of Donald Trump being the czar of investment. Because what he did is he did require that Mexico buy a certain amount of inputs and products from the United States. So there was there even back then it was already pushing us into a worse direction. And one of the things I feel that it's helpful to kind of illustrate this with, by the way, is we often think in terms of tariffs and non-tariff barriers to trade as harming consumers to the benefit of producers. But it's more complex than that, and it typically, really, in the long run, doesn't even benefit producers. One, because producers are some of the major buyers of inputs. So if you're a manufacturer in the United States, something like two-thirds of your inputs actually probably are sourced from abroad, which is why in surveys, three-fourths of manufacturers are saying that they are actually being harmed by the tariffs. So that's kind of a misnomer. But the other thing is, let's say that even you manage to protect a manufacturer. Do you actually benefit them over the long run? I think that it's really hard to make that case. And just think about it from the perspective of parenting. We all know that we want to raise children who are ultimately capable of making their own decisions. Helicopter parenting is not an effective way to, create a human being that is going to manage to negotiate the complex world of today, right? You're going to, if you're constantly are shielding your children from the costs of their mistakes and also the benefits of taking risks and making good choices, you're really depriving them of that. Of the incentive to better themselves and to learn how the world works. Well, what do you suppose happens if we helicopter parent, a company? If we totally control, block it off from the realities of the world, from actual, real world competitors out there, those competitors are still going to exist. They're just protected from them and don't see them. Ultimately, you're creating, it's the coddling of the American economy, is you're creating a bunch of businesses that are like toddlers incapable of handling the actual real world. So I think almost any way you analyze it, you're in sort of infantilizing the businesses and not allowing them to respond to real world conditions to consumers as well as to competitors.
So basically, tariffs are like safe spaces and trigger warnings for American companies.
Exactly. Exactly.
We're, we're tougher than that. I think we are.
Yeah.
Um, so the release we saw a couple weeks ago from Fraser about tariff rates and how higher tariffs have impacted the U.S. Economic freedom ranking, that was described as a pre-release.
Yeah.
Tell us about the whole schedule for economic freedom of the world, how it rolls out, and how the sort of products spin off of it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. So, for these 45 indicators, and some of which even have subcomponents, so there's a large number of data points that go into every country's rating. They are derived from both governments and then non-government entities, the World Bank, researchers, folks like the Economist Intelligence Unit. So we have all of this data in order for it to be an apples to apples comparison across countries. We're relying on third parties, all of which is to say we typically it's delayed by 2 years. So it's usually so in 2025 we'll be able to tell you what's the economic freedom of the world in 2023. And we're always asked, hey, what's going on in Argentina, right now, how's that going to affect their economic freedom? And unfortunately, we're typically in a position to say, we don't know. We can speculate, we can guess, but we're not going to be able to give you a real precise answer because we have to wait for this international data to come out. The case of tariffs is a little different because in this instance, we actually, we know what, thanks to excellent, research, we know exactly what the average tariff rate is. We know, thanks to folks at the Tax Foundation, what the revenue impact of those tariffs are likely to be. We can calculate the things like the standard deviation of the tariff rate to get a sense of how complicated it is. So in this one instance, we were actually able to use real world data and say, here's a preview of what we think is going to happen to U.S. economic freedom in 2025. So it's kind of a unique, this chapter pre-release is kind of a unique opportunity to kind of preview what's happening. And so, based on that, I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, we estimate that U.S. economic freedom was 56th out of 165 in 2023. According to our calculations, Trump's tariffs push us all the way down to 76th. And it actually knocked the U.S. out of or threatened to knock the U.S. out of the top 10 in terms of the world's most economically free countries on the broader index. So that's what's out now. Now, at the end of this month, I think September 25th, we'll be releasing the full Economic Freedom of the World Index, which will then be our estimate of what we think economic freedom was in 165 countries in 2023. We'll have to wait a couple of years to see what happens in terms of actual measured economic freedom if our pre-release is an accurate estimate.
Yeah, that always used to happen when we did annual reports when I worked at the Tax Foundation, which is
Mhm.
people who are honest with statistics have to acknowledge that lag between
Yeah,
when the data, when things happen in the real world and when the data exists. And people always ask us like, well, why don't you have the numbers for this year? I'm like, well, this year isn't over yet. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
that's a good reason why. So, well, I look forward to not just this year because this year's may not be that exciting. I look forward to future years of the Economic Freedom of the World report because I'm not happy with the United States
yeah.
being in Sudan, Djibouti territory, although I'm sure they're lovely, fine people in Sudan and Djibouti.
Mhm.
But policy-wise,
Yeah.
I want to be in Singapore territory.
Yep.
So we'll see if we can get there. Well, Matt, thank you so much for being with us. This has been an excellent conversation. And before we go, why don't you tell people where we can find all of your stuff and Fraser's great research on the internet?
Excellent. Yeah, FrazierInstitute.org. And then if you're interested in economic freedom in particular, you can Google freetheworld.com and that'll take you straight to our economic freedom research. We also have other indices like the Human Freedom Index that looks at broader measures of human freedom, not just are you allowed to make economic decisions, but are you also allowed to make personal decisions. And we have an index measuring economic freedom at the US states and Canadian provinces and Mexican states. So if you want to dig in deeper to understand where your local jurisdiction is, you can check that out as well.
All right. Thank you so much, man.
Thank you.